long time ago, an Austrian writer told the story about business ethics, that he was asked by a young student if he should study business ethics, and his answer was, well, young man, you will have to decide, either or. So what is the main challenge of business ethics, and what is business ethics about?
Well, business ethics in the broad sense, I think, is the discipline that looks at ethical challenges that arise in the course of doing business. So that is, on the one hand, the question of what are people within organizations, people within businesses doing, what are the ethical challenges that they face. But it's also a question about the broader context, about the question of what are the consequences of doing business in particular ways, in particular sectors, for society. So what's the bigger picture?
Business ethics and corporate social responsibility, how do they relate to each other?
One extreme answer would be the Milton Friedman one. The only social responsibility of the company is to make profits. And that would, I think the background to that response is that because companies work in a particular environment, they have the requirement to make profits in order to survive. And the assumption, I think Friedman's assumption, was that the framework would look after the ethical issues. So that's the legal, the societal framework. And if you follow that position, you would say corporations have to focus on making profits. I would disagree with that position, mostly because I think companies are not as constrained by the environment, and they also shape the environment. In particular, big global corporations are not just profit-making enterprises, but they are social players that have impacts on lots of aspects of the environment. And taking that seriously, I think, means that they have to think about what the ethical components of their activities are. And simply focusing just on making money is probably not enough.
If companies engage in business ethics, does it pay off?
Doing the right thing has many possible consequences that are beneficial. So companies, by engaging with the stakeholders, with the communities, are in position to improve the relationships. They're seen as trustworthy. Their products have more acceptance. So there are a variety of ways in which doing the right thing can translate into business advantages, but it's not an automatic process. So if, for example, you want to reach out to stakeholders, if you want to talk to the community, if you want to find out whether the product that you're developing is something that fits within a particular social environment, then that actually costs resources. You need to reach out, you need to put the money into it, you need to develop an infrastructure. Those are things that are directly associated with costs, whereas the benefits are often much less tangible. There may be huge benefits. Now, this may prevent a product from failing, but on the other hand, the costs are very clear and tangible.
Do you know of any corporate cases that show that business ethics can pay off?
Ethics in research has at least two components. One of those is research ethics, so that has to do with how do you conduct the research, what are the implications of undertaking the research as such. So that's what we call research ethics, and that's typically dealt with following the biomedical model through an approval process and so on. So that's the smaller, the more confined aspect of ethics in research, which the European Commission is very keen on ensuring that it's undertaken and that it's done properly. But at the same time, there's a much bigger question around ethics in research, which has to do with the question of where do we want our world to go? How do we want to use research in a way that contributes to a shared view of a desirable society? So this has to do with really big, fundamental political, societal questions about the good life, how we define the good life, how collectively as a society we come to an understanding of where we want to go, and how research and innovation can contribute to that.
Are there any companies or sectors that should engage more in business ethics?
I think it makes no sense to assume that the ethical components of research and innovation can be looked at only for, or in the context of publicly funded research. It needs to reach out to companies, to privately funded research, even though the environments, of course, are slightly different. The incentives are different, the way you can interact is different. But research and innovation, both publicly and privately funded, needs to look at the ethical components.
Ethics is a major component of the responsible research and innovation concept, which was promoted by the European Union for the last 5 years. What are the specific challenges of ethics in research and in innovation?
From my perspective, research is more aimed at the creation of knowledge, so coming up with something new that we didn't know before. And that is often associated with what we call blue skies research, basic research, fundamental research. So this is about finding out aspects of the world that we didn't know before, without necessarily knowing what the consequences will be or what possible implications and applications will be. So that's the research side. For me, innovation is bringing new research or new knowledge, or existing knowledge in many cases, into a different context. So innovation is about application, about doing something in the world. And if you follow that distinction between research as basic creation of knowledge and innovation as application of knowledge, then the ethical issues are fundamentally different. So for research, it's often very difficult to predict what the consequences will be. If you look at fundamental research in quantum technologies, how that will translate into anything at the point where it's discovered is unclear. If that then turns into innovation, if you then use quantum mechanics to develop, for example, quantum computing or quantum encryption, where the idea is to bring this into a social context, then it's typically clear what the applications may be, and therefore the ethical evaluation is completely different.
Do these aspects only address research at universities who are funded by public money, or do they also address innovators in companies?
Ethical requirements in research and innovation cover all stakeholders who are involved in the research. So that's the researchers who very clearly have particular types of responsibilities. It also very clearly encompasses organizations, starting from the research group, the lab, where particular agreements are made on how to do research. They go to the institution, which may be the university, which may be a research institution. But it also goes beyond that. So responsibilities also apply to research funders, for example, the people who provide the resources to do the research, who often have a very strong hand in shaping what the research is that is undertaken. And it goes beyond that to national governments, the people who set research policies, and even beyond that. So in Europe, for example, the European Commission has an important impact on research, and therefore also on the ethical issues, how they're perceived, how they're dealt with, and how they are actually discharged with in the end.
Ethical requirements may be perceived as an additional burden or as an administrative exercise. Is this true?
So I think we can't escape ethics. It's not something that's optional. The question really is, do we worry about the bureaucracy? And I think we need to make sure that that is streamlined as much as possible. But I also think realistically, it's not going to go away. It's something that we just have to deal with.
Could the consideration of ethical aspects also lead to new ideas? So do they serve as a source of inspiration, or is this just a limitation to research and innovation activities?
People who work in the area of responsible innovation tend to focus on this idea of ethics as a source of creativity. And the idea there is that one of the ethical aspects of research would be to engage with multiple stakeholders, to not just sit in your lab and think about whatever it is you want to do, but to reach out to people who may be affected, to people who would play a part in the research, who have some say in how it's supposed to be interpreted. And you do that very early on, what they call upstream. So at the source where things start to develop. And if you do that, there are many good examples of how that actually has changed the way that the research is conceptualized.
What technologies or research areas are the ones that are most affected by the discussions about research and innovation ethics?
In Germany, certainly nuclear research, in particular with regards to both nuclear power and nuclear weapons, was highly contested and never really regained any legitimacy. So it still just remains a marginal area. So genetically modified organisms 15, 20 years ago was a big topic. Again, the consequence of that was that in Europe, at least, it's not a big research area. It's not been commercially successful, partly because we collectively as a society didn't find ways of dealing with the ethical concerns. And at the moment, we have artificial intelligence as a high-profile topic. Generally ICT, I mean, 2 years ago it was more big data, now it's sort of flipped over into artificial intelligence and whatever it may be next year. But I think the the topics that are most in the spotlight are those where it's easiest to see that they can have a social consequence. They will change what we eat, how we work. If there are strong narratives demonstrating that these consequences will arise or are likely to arise, then there's a big ethical interest that leads to a big societal discussion, and then whatever the outcomes of that is will influence how the research is done, but also what the consequences of the research will be.
Smart homes is an area where very different technologies and very different needs come together. We actually don't know how we will live in 2030 in our homes, and none of these companies can design it on its own. And it's an area of responsible innovation. What challenges do you see in the area of smart homes?
The main potential problems that companies working in this area are likely to encounter is what's been called technology push. So the idea that the company develops a product or a service that aims to address some perceived societal need, but that then actually doesn't meet that need. And that, of course, is relatively easily addressed by engaging with the people who are supposed to use them to get stakeholders involved early on, get your potential customers involved, make sure that you understand the problems. So don't push from the technology perspective, but look at what are the needs. So what requirements are there? How can a smart home help people? And then develop your products and services in conjunction and in collaboration with the people who are supposed to use them.
What are the main technological breakthroughs that will shape the way we live at home in the future? What do you expect? How will living at home look like in 10 years from now?
So I think there will be a lot of continuity. So the home in 2030, I would expect, is still going to look very similar to the home it looks today. I don't think it's going to be a high-tech home. Well, there may be some, but I think the majority of people will still want to live a comfortable life in their own four walls. I think the changes are likely to be changes behind the scenes. So things happening, services to be provided to people in the home that are useful for them, but that they don't necessarily have to actively interact with. I think the smart fridge, the long discussed idea that the fridge will order the milk when it's run out, that doesn't seem to have worked. It may turn out I don't want milk, or I don't want this type of milk, or I want less milk. So I think it's got to be smarter than that. And here I think is the challenge, namely to find out what is it that people actually want. What would make our lives better? And if it doesn't make our lives better, why would we want to buy it? So I think that's really the trick. The trick is to see what are current gaps. And I think there is no simple answer to that, because if you look at your life, at your home, can you easily identify what you would like to be different? Well, okay, I would like somebody to clean the house without my input, but those things exist. But is there anything radical that would make our lives better? And I'm not entirely sure that that is clearly identified. And I think that's a challenge.
One technology that's currently quite intensively discussed is artificial intelligence. What are the myths about artificial intelligence? What are the benefits and what are examples of artificial intelligence?
Okay, artificial intelligence is a technology that mimics human cognitive behavior in some way. What exactly constitutes or counts as artificial intelligence changes over time, and some people have said that whatever computers cannot do at a particular time is the next wave of artificial intelligence. As soon as they can do it, it's no longer artificial intelligence, it's old news. At the moment, we see a big discussion around artificial intelligence, which very much focuses on machine learning, which is based on neural networks. So the idea is that computers use large amounts of data in order to do statistical analysis on the data and recognize patterns. That's really at the core of the current debate around artificial intelligence. It turns out that that is a very powerful tool if you have big data and if you can ask the right questions of that data. So it allows you to classify data and even make predictions on the basis of prior occurrences. There are lots of speculations of where it's going to go, and I'm not convinced that these speculations are necessarily grounded in the technology we can see at the moment. So I think the extreme part of that would be the transhumanist, superintelligence, post-humanist view of the world. So machines at some point become so intelligent that they can replicate and improve themselves. That will then lead to a very quick feedback loop where machines then become super intelligent, become much more powerful than human beings. Now, I'm not convinced that that is a realistic scenario with the type of technology we're seeing at the moment, but a lot of very high-profile figures see that. Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking, those are people who saw this idea of the post-human world and thought that this development is particularly threatening to human beings. And there's a debate about whether that's true or not. So I'm not particularly convinced. I think the more interesting questions are really around what does it do to us on a daily basis? Because AI is there now. There are lots of examples of AI being implemented in practice. And I think the interesting question is how will we know what are the consequences and how are we on the receiving end as consumers, as citizens, how are we engaged in the decisions about those technologies as they're being developed?
So the Terminator movie with Skynet as the enemy of mankind, this is not the vision.
I'm not convinced that current technologies are capable of taking that step. So I think the true autonomy that you can see in the Terminator is something that current artificial intelligence technologies simply do not display. They're very good at particular tasks. They can be trained in particular areas to very far exceed human capabilities. And that has been around for a long time. Chess, now it's Go. Maybe driving. So there are certain things that machines can do very well, but they do not at this point have a generalized intelligence that would allow them to draw conclusions beyond their area of expertise. So the Go computer cannot simply turn around and then play a different game.
What does the term singularity mean in this context?
Singularity stands for the point where the computers come to the position where they can replicate themselves and then infinitely improve themselves. So the idea is that at the singularity point, the computers not only become self-aware and become capable of reproducing themselves, but because they can do this, then they can speed that up infinitely. So they can improve themselves, and because they're then better, they can improve themselves even further, which means that they then become sort of super beings.
So at the moment, artificial intelligence is mainly used for pattern recognition.
Yes.
And for self-learning algorithms within a certain limit of rules of the game. As you said, Go or chess or identifying patterns of breast cancer. What about this self-modification, this kind of self-transcendence? Is there any vision or any idea how a Go computer could then become a chess computer, or is this technically impossible?
There is research trying to bring the learning capabilities of artificial neural networks and other types of AI closer to what humans can do. Now, that of course requires us to understand how humans learn, which at this point we have ideas about, there are theories about. I don't think we have general consensus about it. It's an example where neuroscience and artificial intelligence are actually potentially synergetic in that understanding the brain and the functions of the brain better may help us to develop computers better that can mimic certain things that humans do in a better way.
Are there any ethical concerns regarding artificial intelligence?
There are many concerns about artificial intelligence, and they span a broad range of issues. From security to privacy, so artificial intelligence may create new threats to privacy because it can combine different data sets in different ways which were unforeseen, which may break anonymity or pseudonymity. But I think there are also big issues around societal concerns. So artificial intelligence at the moment is something that is very much the realm of the big companies. They own the algorithms, they own the data. And therefore, artificial intelligence now plays into oligopolies, into monopolies, into power concentrations, political and economic power concentrations, which now is a big concern. We have questions around security, liability. So if autonomous vehicles, for example, hit the streets, who's responsible for firstly programming them, who's responsible if something goes wrong? So there are many concerns around ethical components of both the development of AI, but also, and more importantly, of the use and social implications of AI.
Big data in AI is often linked to big companies, as you said, Amazon, Google, and so on. Is Europe a player in AI? Are European companies big players in AI?
The algorithms and the principles are probably universal, but how they are used will be locally specific. So in Europe at this point, as part of the General Data Protection Regulation, you have a right not to have decisions about you made without human interference. This is something that, as far as I know, doesn't exist. This right doesn't exist in other countries. So it may well be that in America, an autonomous machine could make decisions about you, which it wouldn't be allowed to do here. So there's a differentiation between those. The other thing then is, of course, with regards to the data. So the data that is used to train AI may well be locally specific.
What about the concern that AI might at some time be a black box? Decisions come out, but we don't understand what's happening in this black box. Are there any kind of initiatives that we as human beings still know what's happening in this black box?
There are many initiatives to that respect. Again, according to European legislation, we have a right to an explanation as to why a particular decision was made or why a classification was made. It is not entirely clear how that is to be technically implemented, but there's much research going on around explainability and transparency of AI. And the question is, at what level do we need to be able to explain it? Because one problem is that the owners of the algorithms will typically not be willing to share those, so they don't want the rest of the world to know how exactly the decision was made. But that doesn't mean that we can't gain understanding as to the parameters that go in and come out. So one suggestion, for example, would be that we could do a counterfactual test. So if we hadn't put this person in but this person in, what would have been the outcome? And that might give us the level of insight into what's happening in the black box that's sufficient for us to say, yes, we find this acceptable or not.
Thank you very much.